So It Goes, by jadewritesstuff. Summary. Her nose budged against his, her parted lips teasing his barely. Eyes closed, Lucy leaned in for a kiss, but stopped short. Her hands splayed across his chest, slowly trailing down his stomach. I mean, if you'd rather go back to bed, he inhaled, waiting for her lips to touch his and for her hands to slip below his waist. But she stopped. Instead, she gave him an innocent smile. That's fine with me. Gru is everything she could ask for. But Lucy wants more. After their first time spending the night together, it took a while for Gru to grow comfortable with the act, and even the thought of sex. But he couldn't have been given a more supportive partner than Lucy. Quite out of practice herself, though experienced enough with men and women, she guided them through a slow process. What they liked, what they didn't. More specifically, she helped him give and receive things without panicking, especially when she pleasured him. Dear God, there was something truly stimulating about making Lucy feel good, to make her sound good, to hear those sweet moans and her breath hitching as she called his name. Yet, it was different with the roles reversed. No doubt she made him feel good. So good. He floated on clouds whenever she touched him. But it was clear that his reluctance stemmed from the insecurity of disappointing her, and the fact that the first time he entered her, he came instantly. An embarrassing, truly grave-digging moment. Lucy didn't mind. She found it endearing. As a matter of fact, that night was positively overwhelming. The entire trajectory of their relationship changed, and they found themselves even more in love with each other. And soon after a few tries, Lucy slowly convincing Gru he was fine, those insecurities vanished. They found themselves caught up in the moment far more often than the first few times. He finally let her undress him, and he loved undressing her. He stopped suppressing his sounds of arousal, often finding himself more vocal than Lucy. Confidence reached impeccable heights, especially after almost getting caught in the AVL cleaning closet. New things, positions, stimulations, slight dirty talk tried. It was mind-blowing moving forward in that stage of their relationship. But the most important part? Being comfortable enough with someone to do that. He never imagined that day would come, and his past self wouldn't have instantly jumped to arousing thoughts as soon as he walked into a room. He couldn't help it at that moment. After another night pleasantly spent with his wife soft, slow, he panicked when he awoke a few hours later without her in the bed. He tiptoed downstairs. Alertness triggered as he geared himself up to expect the worst. But there was nothing to worry about. His wife stood in the kitchen pouring hot water into a mug, humming to herself. Gru smiled, appreciating how cute his wife was, even whilst doing the most mundane of things. And then his eyes traveled lower, her blue robe wrapped around her form, hugging her curves. Nightdress missing, peeled off during their night together. The hem of her robe hung along the middle of her thighs. Gru pictured how high it'd rise if he placed one hand on her waist and the other on her upper back, bending her over the table nicely. Gru? His eyes snapped upward, meeting the transfixing gaze of his wife. Those emerald eyes saw through everything. It was difficult to sneak up on Lucy. It must have been a sixth sense at this point. Trying to clear those past inappropriate thoughts, he slipped beside her at the bar table. "Hey!" Lucy smiled, closing her eyes with a hum as her husband joined her. She sipped on peppermint tea. She only drank peppermint if something bothered her. He pouted. "Everything okay?" Lucy shrugged, blowing gently on the tea. "I couldn't sleep. Sorry if I scared you." "No, it's okay, honey." He wrapped an arm around her. "You're so sneaky, I didn't even notice." She smirked. "Oh, you were sound asleep. I must have knocked you out real good." Gru smiled. "Better doing it that way rather than tasering me." Lucy laughed. "At least you're thankful this time." She took another sip of her tea. A satisfied smile spread across her face. "Do you want one?" "I'm okay, thank you, love." Gru kissed her on the head, eyes closing for a moment. "So, you couldn't sleep?" "Mm-hmm." She set the mug down. "Nothing serious. You just got me in a sweat, that's all. Gotta soothe the throat." He always tried not to bolster his confidence, but those comments made it a challenge, especially when he knew he was making his wife feel good. As long as you're not hurt, Lucy smiled. Even when she tried to shift the mood, he always found a way to melt her heart. No, but it got me thinking too. She lay a hand on his, which still curved around her waist. You're soft most of the time. He tilted his head. Soft? The expression proved her point. Lucy stifled a laugh. You know, like, when we're in the moment. Gru raised his eyebrows. Oh, well, I like knowing you're comfortable. And I love that too. Lucy pressed a soft kiss on his cheek. More than you could ever know. Then her hand started tracing up and down his arm, her nails treading with a light feather touch. But why don't you try something different? Like tap into that other side. Gru swallowed. It became increasingly difficult focusing on her words, whilst her nails grazed his skin, something that drove him crazy, as well as a slight ache below his waistband. Other side? She mirrored his tilted head with a smile. Come on. Setting the cup down on the table, she turned and tucked herself closer against him, her fingers slowly tiptoeing up his chest. I know there's someone else in there. That villainous, reckless part of you that wants more. To throw me on that bed, grab me like a rag doll, and use me until I beg you to stop, she thought, but didn't dare say aloud. With her chest pressed against his torso, Gru found himself a clearer view of her cleavage peeking behind her robe. She must have sensed it, as her free hand slipped up to her robe tie, tugging the fabric slowly. Once the knot released, she teased the opening, fingers gently pulling at the side front so he could get a sweeter view of her chest. Gru inhaled. It was only a few hours ago since he'd touched and kissed her naked body, yet every time he saw even the slightest peek of her bare skin, it was like the first time all over again. The thought of her soft skin burning underneath his palms, his mouth cupping and tasting the gentle mounds of her breasts, moistened his lips. Of course he wanted more. He wanted to slam her on that table, grab her hair and her waist and her everything, to taste and grab and fuck her. But that slight insecurity jumped out as he cleared his throat and swallowed. We have work tomorrow. Lucy slipped off from the stool, still gazing up at him. The lapels of his pajama shirt were undone, easy access for her to turn and grab them, pulling him up against her. And your point? Her eyes clouded with lust already. She took a moment to press herself against him, grabbing the sides of him so her hips grazed his own. A repressed moan behind her lips, as the bulge of his already hardened cock grazed her clit. His eyes fluttered closed, a trembling sigh releasing. Her nose budged against his, her parted lips teasing his barely. Eyes closed, Lucy leaned in for a kiss, but stopped short. Her hand splayed across his chest, slowly trailing down his stomach. I mean, if you'd rather go back to bed. He inhaled, waiting for her lips to touch his, and for her hands to slip below his waist. But she stopped. Instead, she gave him an innocent smile. That's fine with me. She reached for her mug, taking a cautious sip, whilst casting a longing gaze at her husband. Her acting skills worked a charm she knew he wouldn't resist, especially as his breathing deepened. I suppose we should get some sleep, Lucy murmured, finding it tricky to revert back to her normal tone when she already hyped herself up for his thick cock. But she knew he'd cave in, and she was right. His hands grew sweaty, heart thumping, pants already tightened to the point of no return. He grabbed the mug from her grasp, placed it back on the coaster, and wrapped his arms around her waist so he could press her against the table. His lips caught hers, instantly hungry. Lucy soon returned the kiss with equal fervor, her hands reaching behind his neck and grazing his skin with her nails. She hummed a laugh as she felt him shiver. A slip of his tongue between her lips was a reasonable response. Her own head tilted back as she tried to keep up. As always, he'd start trailing gentle kisses down her jaw, moving downward. These kisses were starving, desperate, wanting, needing more. A sigh brushed past her lips as Gru kissed and nipped at her skin. One hand slipped away from his nape, choosing to squeeze at his side as he kissed her. He wasted no time reaching her collarbone, and eventually her cleavage. Brushing away the sides of her robe, he teased a few pecks across her breasts. He stopped for a moment, choosing to grab her thighs and hoist them around his hips. Now, she was carried and pinned to the wall. Nowhere for her to run, as if she wanted to. His mouth got back to work, tongue wrapped around her breast and the erect nipple, paying both sides equal amounts of attention. Lucy dared to let out a satisfied moan, groping his arms and squeezing them for leverage. That was until Gru panicked and pressed his hand around her mouth. They were still in the kitchen, where anyone could hear and walk in. The girls, the minions, Nefario. It wasn't the most practical of places to fuck. But whilst Gru focused on that, Lucy's eyes widened. She glanced down at the pressure her husband held on her jaw, how his fingers gripped her skin, not too rough, but hard enough to erupt a sigh against his hand. Gru blinked. The realization struck him. She liked it. So he played further. "You need to be quiet," he warned, breath slightly jagged as it was more of a tease than a reminder. His mouth returned to work at the hollow of her neck. As his hand slipped away, now residing just below her neck, Lucy finally grinned. She gazed at him through half-lidded eyes, a mischievous tone to her voice as she whispered, "Oh yeah? Why don't you make me?" His lips stopped. Glance returned upward. Lips parted slightly. Lucy smirked. "You heard me," readjusting his grip around her thighs. Gru walked them both to the round booth table. "Oh, I heard you," he murmured, placing her down on the edge. "That's what you want, Achim." Gru's hand nudged against her shoulder, laying her back flat against the table. He lowered himself slightly so he could kiss her once again. Her nails returned to his scalp, coaxing him to stay. She wanted him to silence her, so that was his task. Instead, he slipped from her lips, once again leaving hot kisses down her jawline, her neck, the valley between her breasts, and slowed the pace as he reached her abs. Lucy threw her head back, closing her eyes and biting her lip to suppress a moan. Gru smiled against her skin as he noticed her breathing quicken. Her muscles tensed as he traveled lower, closer towards the spot both of them wanted most. "I think you're finally catching on." Lucy breathed a laugh, until it was condensed with another sigh. Luckily for him, her robe was easy enough to tug away from her form. His hands wrapped around her thighs, so he could open and slip between her long legs. He gripped and grabbed, pulling her towards his own. Lucy slipped her hands down his stomach, wrapping around his waist. Pulling him closer wasn't enough. She needed him to use her like a foolish agent getting caught in his villainous trap. And yes, she'd fantasized about this multiple times, before and after dating him. Before he could move his hands again, Lucy sat up and caught him in another heated kiss. It wasn't fair that she was already bare for him to soak up with his eyes, whilst he still wore his own pajamas. Fixing the matter, she slipped off his pajama shirt and tugged on his white vest. He helped by pulling it over his head, smirking as she could finally lay her hands on his bare chest. "That's much better." Lucy squeezed at his sides, feeling herself grow wetter with the sounds of her husband's needy sighs. She knew how to push his buttons. Even the smallest form of stimulation worked him up, so she pushed even further. She caught onto his hand, slowly traveling up her thigh. Sneaky, her hand slipped to his wrist, tugging his hand up towards her mouth instead. She slipped his middle and ring fingers into her mouth, lightly sucking on them to provide enough moisture. Closing her eyes for a moment, she hummed as she worked. She gazed back up at him as she worked harder, bobbing her head gently, moaning against his fingers with glistening, lust-driven eyes. Gru swallowed. He used every fiber in his being to stop himself from grinding against her, but then remembered that's what she wanted. So when she let go of his fingers, Gru dived back for another kiss. As his hips rutted against her, a gasp slipped from her lips. Her hand shot out to grasp his arm, squeezing him tight as she struggled to keep up with his kisses. And soon, without warning, his hands replaced his hips by returning to her thighs, and his now glistening fingers found a rhythm encircling her clit. He slid them through her slit, teasing her gently as he contemplated whether to stay or opt for his fingers inside her instead. She doesn't answer, except for a satisfied moan behind her tightly shut lips. Even then, Gru still pressed his hand against her jaw, her head tilted back, eyes closed as his tight grip made her see stars. Eventually, he knew what to do. She didn't deserve one or the other, she needed both. With that, he knelt down. He untied the knot on his pajama pants to relieve the tightness in his pants, and closed his mouth around her clit. One hand gripped her thigh, whilst the other made light work inside her with a gentle tempo to start with. He sighed against her hot skin, the aroma of her throbbing cunt driving him insane. One leg threw itself over his shoulder, her strength drawing him closer. Without his hand to keep her quiet, Lucy found herself growing more aroused at the thought of keeping herself quiet. How could she, when her husband made her feel like the only woman to walk the earth? Especially with the way his mouth indulged in her, like he'd never tasted something just as sweet before. And he made sure she knew, as his tongue worked at directly her clit, whilst his fingers made themselves useful in fucking her faster. Her juices left his hand completely soaked, slapping against her, which was enough for Lucy to clap a hand around her mouth and hoist herself up slightly with her free arm. Her legs wrapped tight around his shoulders, the clench of her thighs trapping him for a moment. Gru didn't mind as he continued his pace. This was his idea of paradise. Lucy couldn't have thrown her head back any further into the table if she tried. There was no point trying to keep herself upright, choosing instead to fall backward and rest her hand on his head, pushing him further, deeper into her thighs. Biting down on the back of her palm, she suppressed a loud gasp as she finally came. Oh, her inner thighs throbbed, sending waves up her clit and pooling across her stomach. Avoiding the possibility of waking the entire house, Lucy lifted her head up with a quiet moan, her other hand still splayed across her husband's head, hips trembling. As she rode her high, Gru shut his eyes, bathing in the sweet sensation of his wife's soaked cunt, and the delicate sounds she made. It was all too much for him. His cock struggled against his pants, desperate for attention. You okay?" he murmured, standing up and positioning himself between her thighs. Lucy tried to laugh, still chasing her breath. She wasn't sure if it was his innocent comment or the way he wiped his lips with his thumb, but she felt hungry for more. She hoisted herself up, limbs shaking with excitement. Her eyes pleaded as she met his gaze. "What?" he teased, enjoying how submissive she looked as he stood taller against her. And when his voice dived that low, when the accent sounded like a growl, she couldn't even describe what she wanted him to do to her without concerning feminism. Lucy said nothing, leaving her hands to work at his pants instead. Luckily for her, the pajama pants were thin silk, leaving a delectable outline of his hard cock ready for her to touch. Her hand cupped the bulge, squeezing gently as she tried to ignore how soaked her robe underneath her thighs felt. She slowly tugged the waistband of his pants, her heart thundering against her chest as his cock sprung out. Her hand wasted no time working him up well, not that he needed more after eating her out. She was simply edging him. One fingertip traced his tip, spreading his pre-cum, making him jerk slightly. That soon traveled down his shaft, with a full hand moving back upward in an agonizingly slow pattern. Lucy swallowed as she felt her hand rub against the veins on his cock. Gru's head dipped, eyes closed. A longing groan slipped from his lungs. He was close enough for Lucy to lean against him, her voice grazing his face. She purred. "I want you. Every bit of you. Don't think about it. Just fuck me." He bristled. His wife rarely swore unless provoked, for one, and her hand topped it off by slipping underneath his cock with a gentle grope. That alone was enough for his own hand to grab her just underneath her jaw, slight pressure to the sides of her neck. She definitely liked it, judging by the way she stared at him, her hands stopping the previous movements. Her lips parted in a passionate, teasing smile. With his hands still around her throat, he tugged her close and replied, "You want me to fuck you?" He would have let her continue stroking him, but this was about her. She asked for it, so she would get it. He replaced her hand on his cock with his own, slipping further between her legs so she could trap him. She hooked her heels around his waist, tugging him closer. Eyes closing for a moment, Lucy swallowed as she felt his grip tighten around her neck. Not too rough, but enough for her lick her dry lips. His cock grazed her clit. Oh yes, she wanted that. She needed that. So bad, she appreciated most of the times that he treated her with all the delicacy a person could hold. Gru always prioritized her pleasure over his, but sometimes that primal urge inside her wanted to be used to his own benefit. Her pleasure derived from making him feel good. To hear those sweet, desperate groans that slipped from his mouth whenever he hit a particularly good spot. With a few satisfying strokes to indicate he was ready, Gru rubbed the tip of his cock up her slit. He slipped back down for good measure, drawing out a needy moan from his wife. Even he exhaled, the sensitivity almost making him come there and then. Before he could, and potentially ruin the moment, he slipped himself inside her. Every thought in her mind dwindled as soon as she felt herself being filled by his thick cock. Eyes fluttering closed, Lucy grabbed onto his shoulders and dug her nails into his skin. Gru couldn't help the low growl. He tried ignoring how tight, how hot she felt gripping his cock, but it was killer. With a shuddery exhale, Gru pushed her back against the table, with his hand still wrapped around her jaw. His other hand balled a fistful of her robe as he began thrusting inside her. No more build-up. He instantly drove his cock into her in hopes of chasing her high. Lucy struggled to retain her breath. As her husband's frantic pace increased without warning, sweat glistened across her skin, and her stomach flipped the more she heard his own clapping against hers. So much for being quiet. Lucy smirked to herself. His knuckles, white-gripped with her robe inside his palm, brushed against her hip from time to time. While she was slightly ticklish, it only made her hornier. His thumb pressed tighter into her jawline. "Look at me," he murmured. She let out a whimper. If she could fuck his voice, she would. Whilst he kept a firm grip on her jaw, the hand holding her robe slipped down to her clit and started to rub her in circles. Her hips jolted, a hand shooting out to clutch the hand around her throat. Lucy edged her lips toward his. His hand tugged her closer so he could kiss her. He felt her soft moan against his tongue as he slipped through her lips, his head spinning like an erratic blender. But she knew what he was trying to do make her come first. Whilst she did want him to take control, two could play at that game. His skin was flammable. Her fingertips struck his pelvis like matches. Lucy slipped away from his lips. Making sure his eyes were on her, Lucy offered him a reaction that caught his breath a satisfied eye roll into closed lids, accompanied by a smile. When he arched into a sweet spot, her lips paved way for a delicate sigh. Paired with the captivating swing of her breasts as he fucked her, Gru almost lost his rhythm. He pounded harder, refusing to give in. She wasn't always one for dirty talk. Most of the time she took advantage of as many puns as possible, mainly due to her anxiousness. But sometimes it kick-started her arousal. But when she found herself in that needy type of mood, you feel so good. She knew exactly what to say. Whether blood rushed to his cheeks or drained to his cock, Gru wasn't sure. Her words slivered down his chest, provoking his hips to quicken. Thrusting faster and harder, his fingers found a smooth, circular rhythm on her clit. She sounded so good. His name rolled off her tongue like water falling from a fountain. Sometimes he couldn't help thinking about how her mouth was made for his name to be moaned from. Her body made for him to fuck and claim as his own. Of course, she was much more than that. But remembering that thought sparingly, he felt his thighs tighten. Just a few more. But the sounds of his skin slapping against hers and her thirsty moans drove him crazy. She was so hot. Clenching his eyes shut, Gru released a jagged moan as he struggled to a stop. His cock throbbed, spilling his cum deep inside her cunt. Eyes fluttered closed. Lucy sighed as her husband came inside her. Her hand slipped to his stomach, splaying her fingers across his hot skin. Mostly he found himself either using protection or pulling out early. No way would he put her in a position to take some medication for his own benefit. Whilst he came inside her, something tapped in the back of her mind. This isn't a good idea, but her feral side ignored it. It was only one time, and it felt so good. that even with his slowed thrusts, the frantic rubbing of her clit sent an aggressive pulse through her pelvis. Lucy gasped deeply before exhaling a content sigh as her head tilted backwards. Her heartbeat tripled as she chased her breath, legs trembling as she felt each throb in her clit. Gru loosened the hand around her neck, opting to grab the table instead, his grip too deathly for his wife as he steadied his breath. With one hand still on her hip, he felt Lucy's hand glided across his wrist. That was what I wanted, Lucy smirked, still sprawled out on her back. How is that for you? Soon catching his breath, Gru lifted her back from the table. He smiled as she gazed up at him through half-lidded eyes, before drawing her in for a long, passionate kiss. Both hands lay just underneath her face, whilst her hands snaked around his neck. As he drew away, Gru rested his forehead against hers. You're amazing, Lucy smirked. I know, Gru huffed with a smile. I love you. Lucy mirrored his smile, hands slipping to cup his face. I love you too. They stayed there for a moment, basking in the afterglow and the calming presence of each other, eyes closed. His hand slipped down to the table as he pulled out of her, but his brows furrowed as his release dripped out, spilling down her thigh. Whilst Lucy couldn't have thought of anything more enticing, Gru's throat felt dry. Lucy? He panicked. It's fine. She tilted his head back up to face her. But it's just one time. Lucy gave him a brief kiss. Besides, we can handle another. Gru exhaled, his shoulders slumping. Tugging her robe back over her shoulders, Lucy winked. I'm kidding. I'm sure we'll get away with it. Gru nodded slowly, though his frown wouldn't waver. His eyes scanned her neck. I didn't hurt you, did I? We just had some pretty awesome sex, and you're worried about that. Lucy chuckled as his hand caressed her skin. I know. Gru blushed, his hand dropping to his side. He almost had to laugh at how quickly his anxiety kicked in. I just want to make sure you're okay. Lucy took his hand, placing a kiss on top of his palm. I'd fill you in on any room for improvement. I promise. Giving her a content smile, Gru pulled up his pajama pants, stuffing his tender cock back inside. He moved slowly towards the bar area, grabbing a handful of kitchen paper. Oh, I see how it is. You just gonna leave me here? Lucy snickered, though she knew what he was doing. Gru smirked, returning with a handful of kitchen towel. He wiped her thighs with tender touches. Although the image of his cum dripping slowly from her used cunt was truly a wicked and alluring sight for his eyes. Tossing the paper into the bin, he put on a teasing tone. If that's another part of what you want me to try? Lucy shook her head, thankful as his hand slipped into hers. He helped her stand, noticing how she tried to hide her shaky legs. She struggled, unable to ignore the ache between her legs. A satisfying ache, however. I got what I wanted. For now, I think I just want cuddles. She glanced back to the bar table. And another tea, since it's probably cold now. Gru tapped his lip. I wonder who let it go cold in the first place. Lucy's jaw dropped, pretending to be shocked. Hey, I have priorities. Nodding, Gru slipped a hand under her thighs and one around her waist, lifting her from the ground. Lucky for you, I'm a versatile man. She laughed as he nuzzled his face against hers. Nestled in his arms, Lucy felt her body melt into a relaxed state, unaware that her husband could tire her out so easily, and she wanted more of that in the future. I just